And thank you all for being here and your interest in strategy for sustainability transitions. And I think it is safe to say that if we are all gathered here today, it's because we recognize some of these issues as grand challenges of our time in our society. And we recognize also the need to change, to transition. Yeah. And that is basically behind our motivation for our book that is being printed as we speak. So what we try to do here is tackle that big question. We are trying to uncover what it engenders, that transition, that change for communities, their relationship with the environment, of course, and very importantly, at the core of our work, the role of governance in that process of change. And so here we have a few nice words from colleagues and friends to our book. And I would like to mention that this is also the result of work that we have been doing already for many years, and that has focused on resource communities. Resource communities, as you know, is very special places that have faced many difficulties in change, in transitioning, in finding new paths. And so a lot of the work that we've done, and this is also, you can also find this as a recent book that we published last year on resource communities, based on also the work here in many resource communities in Alberta, but also in Newfoundland. And worked there also, we worked there with collaborators that have worked in resource communities in other places of the world, in South Africa, Spain, Colombia. And so for us, resource communities have helped us to uncover these difficulties based on the past, these legacies of the past we talk about, that can come up and be expressed in many different ways. So initially, this paper here that we're showing and portraying some of those ways in which these past, the histories of the past, become explicit in the present and in the form of fantasies. And that particular paper led then to the development of that idea further in the book. And we talk about, won't talk too much about it, but these legacies of the past, these histories have different shapes and forms. They can be cognitive legacies, they can be material in the material environment, but they can also be organizational legacies in the way that communities decide to organize themselves. So we talk about the role of the past in these legacies, and that, of course, very informative when we're talking about transitions, and the role of the past in seeing possibilities of a different future, a different path. And that then leads us, sorry about the formatting here, it's not technology, not collaborating, but this leads us then to the question of what is sustainability, what is strategy, what is transition? Those are questions that we're also tackling, because it is also, as we realize, not something that can be taken for granted, that there seems to be a homogeneous look or a definition of what sustainability is, what strategy is, what transition is, but we realize through our work that it requires further thought. So we're going to talk about these things in our book, in our presentation today, and how then that is shaping or informing strategies for strategy for sustainability transition. At the core of our work, at the core of the strategy for sustainability transitions, as I've mentioned already, is governance, and understanding governance. And so, strategy for sustainability transition needs to be located in governance. That means that we need to understand how collective decision-making processes take place in whatever context we're interested. Yeah. So we're going to talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
The presentation looks a little different.
Yeah.
That technology, but anyway, so yes, if we say we need or there is a need for sustainability transitions, and we need a strategy for that, it needs to be located in governance, that is the places, the configurations of actors, institutions where decisions can be taken in a legitimate way, a decision that can bind to the community then, that means, for example, plans that can be followed up. We use a particular understanding of governance that comes out of, am I pushing the right button here? Oh, out of our older work that we are still developing. That is a perspective on governance where co-evolution is the key term, basically. Actors and institutions, they shape each other over time. Power and knowledge shape each other over time. And our perspective, I won't go into all the details here, is influenced by some of these thinkers, but it's not copy-paste work, it's new theoretical architecture. And what is interesting, or we believe useful here, is that it tells us more about the possibilities and the difficulties of change. Oh, this is the wrong button again. Of change. Now, what are institutions? We don't have to go really in detail. There's many institutionalist theories, of course, for us. We're influenced by institutional economics here mostly, more than sociologists. That is, they're the rules of interaction, the rules that guide interaction between actors. Those can be simple rules, but they can also be composite rules that we then call policies, plans, or laws. We also recognize am I doing something wrong here? Okay, whatever. Informal institutions, meaning that besides, maybe a formally enacted plan or policy, there's always a world of informal coordination mechanisms that could be good or bad, but usually, no, always there is a combination of those two. Now you see my very handsome friend Michel Foucault, from whom we stole the concept of power knowledge. Why is that important? We didn't invent that, of course. In critical policy studies, critical management studies, they also lean on that idea that power and knowledge shape each other also. And this is especially relevant for policy, for governance. What kind of knowledge that you build into a governance system is going to have a lot of implications for the power relations. The other way around has implications for what you can do by means of collective decision making. Now, if we're talking of transitions, we're speaking of big change and coordinated change. We want to change the relation between society and the environment, maybe not to die collectively. That's a good reason to do that, of course. But first of all, we need to understand then, how can we understand our own tools to create change? How can we understand the governance systems that evolve themselves? How can we understand the processes of flexibility and change, rigidity and flexibility in governance itself? And there, one basic point, but we believe it is an important point, is, okay, I'm doing this wrong every time it seems, that there's always a combination of rigidity and flexibility in the development path of a particular governance system. And it's not that one is wrong and the other is right. Each emphasis has pros and cons, and we just need to see what works in a particular context. We would like to highlight some of the sources of flexibility, because if we say transition, we're also saying we probably almost certainly need to change the governance systems themselves, not just new policies in the existing machinery, but we'll have to rebuild the machinery. So what are some sources of flexibility there? And then we don't have to go into details for everything here, but I like to highlight, if I'm succeeding in that highlighting. Okay, I'll drop this highlighting. That redundancy is a good thing. This idea comes out of systems theory. That also means for policy that it can be really good that there's more than one way to organize something. There's more than one pathway of coordinating decision-making and implementing a decision. And my good friends, the Soviets, they knew that because they had a planning system that supposedly was top-down, but in reality, not at all. But it kind of worked because they often had 2, 3, 4 ways to achieve something, which is not efficient at all, of course. And in the case of the Soviet Union, we should have used that example, it collapsed at some point. But redundancy itself, that is a good thing. And the drive for efficiency, simplification, also lean government, and so forth. Much of the rhetoric from public management, for example, is really quite problematic. If we have the minimal tools available to respond to change in the environment or to rebuild ourselves, that's really going to be problematic. Another concept, of course, not so strange, is diversity. And diversity as a good thing, not just as in race or class, but as in really different perspectives that have the capacity to kind of annoy each other, to reflect on each other, to contradict each other, and so forth. Because that diversity of perspectives, that helps in the building of resilience for the system itself. The fact that there's different levels in governance, that's also quite helpful. Now, we said we want to take another look at the basic concepts of sustainability, transition, strategy. Before we can say much about strategy for sustainability transition, let's look at sustainability now.
Yeah. Thank you. So one of the key message here is, and I think Kristof was already hinting at that, is we're talking about systems and not simple systems. We're talking about complex systems. Now, so we know already that there is no simple balance. There's no simple solution to understanding complex systems. Now, complex systems are not linear. It's not just you push one button and then you get a result. You present one policy and you get the result. Now, complex systems are about complex interactions between the system and the environment. There's many unpredictable pathways, as Kristof was saying. There's redundancies in complex systems, that we sometimes have to admit won't be able to see or evidence or quantify. So there are invisible effects to these interactions between the system and its environment. It is also in terms of sustainability. Now, when we're talking about sustainability of a particular system, societal system, social ecological system, we need to think of its context. The context becomes very important. Sustainability is contextual. It is not a copy-paste recipe. And it is contextual in the way that the system is thinking about itself and about its environment and its relationship with the environment. And for us here in our story, then it becomes important to note that this complexity also is stemming from these configurations of narratives. This was mentioning institutions, actors. That is part of that complexity that needs to be also part of that definition or that view on sustainability. And that there are always internal contradictions. And one point here that is not visible here in the slide is, despite all this, we can agree that sustainability for us is thinking of a better future. And so that is one thing that we can agree with and can include there in our view of sustainability. And so this is a way of illustrating all these complexities here, stemming from social ecological systems, our perspective. Where do we place governance in social ecological systems? And so we have complexity here of the social system and the ecological system in different ways that the social system is interacting with its environment. And we can discern coordinated actions. And those coordinated actions is what we call actions that are coming through governance. And then we also have to recognize that there are actions that are non-coordinated. that are beyond the governance system, beyond the collective decision system. Yeah, and there's always, of course, interactions also from those coordinated actions onto the social system. This is our view of social ecological systems and how we place governance in that. This is a little bit more detailed image of the mechanics, how we view that, yeah. And so we have actors in that social system, each actor, groups of individuals usually, with different ideas, different discourses, different narrative stories about themselves, about the environment, that portray an image of that environment. And sometimes those narratives are coordinated, are harmonized, yeah, sometimes not. Sometimes there's also contradictions between those different narratives in a certain actor. Yeah. So that's also a place of where you can find a complexity. And the important thing here, each discourse, each narrative then can convey a different type of relationship with that environment. And one thing that is important to mention here is that idea of naturalization. Yeah, it is basically, yeah, presenting what is contingent, yeah, what is necessary, yeah, as something natural, what counts as real. And so another way of seeing it is, yeah, what the system, the governance system, is trying to do is to present things that are maybe cultural or part of its history as natural. It's the obvious way of doing it because it is the way we've always done it, as part of our environment. Yeah. And in that way, then the governance system, societal system, is stabilizing certain narratives in itself. Yeah. And so, yeah. Transition strategies, perhaps just to note here, are then contingent on the nature of these dominant narratives and identities that are naturalized in the system. Yeah. Do you want to add something?
No, just it of that last point, but that's useful maybe. The computer.
Well, yeah, that governance systems is important to keep in mind. That the governance systems have power. They have the power to transform, and that is why also we emphasize the importance of focusing on understanding, trying to understand these complexities of the collective decision-making system, of our governance systems. Yeah, they have the power to transform. They can also incorporate stories and make them natural. So, so that is something important to mention. I think I'm not forgetting anything. Yeah, and so that leads us then to talking about transitions then.
Yeah.
And how is it that we're going to deal with change and transitions given that background?
Yeah, I'll just add two words to that point of construction of reality, because that is abstract, it is philosophical, but it is something with very, very important practical implications. What is taken for granted as reality in a governance system when they start working in decision making, how problems are defined, what is the hierarchy of problems. That is really important also because very often we see for sustainability, but also for transition, an assumption that we already know what it is, what the problems are, and then we just start working from there. But in fact, of course, we don't really know what that is. We know there's problems. We know that our current systems of governance and the ways our societies work, that's not very sustainable, however we want to define it. So we need some form of transition. We know that too. And because often we want certainties, and governance systems are under pressure too, also in democratic systems, because they want to be efficient, they want to show result, they want to be certain about what they're doing. So then something like sustainability becomes reduced to 7 indicators. Something like transition becomes reduced to a recipe, a procedure in 5 steps. And for example, the most famous transition perspective, one that originated in Holland and now it's famous everywhere, social technical transition thinking, starting with little niches, then you know how to upscale and so forth. You go from niche transitions to system transitions and so forth. The point is not that that would be wrong, that can be productive. The point is more that it's really problematic to present that as a general recipe. So much of the literature there assumes that we know where we have to go and we actually can objectively figure out how to do that. We can always use the same steps to do that. And I'm pushing the wrong button once again. So what could it be then? What could it be then a transition? Well, in the most general sense, the awareness that we need to change. We need to change. We need to change our relationship with the natural environment. We need to act differently, not ruin our environment. We start to understand that we will ruin ourselves at some point then. But it has to be some kind of comprehensive and coordinated process of change. We don't know exactly what it is, but we do know that if we don't act, that is a much bigger risk than the risks coming with the uncertainties of how to do a transition. Now, here, what we try to say there is that the literature on the transitions most often pretends to be certain where it is not. That is very risky. But the transitions themselves, if we know, let's say in a particular municipality, but that can also be in a country, we need to change quickly. The focus of the change should be, solving this and that environmental problem or our dependence on a certain carbon that we like very much in Alberta. Then there is also a real risk of simplifying the understanding of governance and simplifying governance itself, simplifying the understanding of the relations between the governance system, the community, the environment, which can then jeopardize many of the qualities of the existing system. This can introduce new inequalities. It can create different environmental problems that we didn't predict. It can also, a variety of things that we will mention later. So, yeah, the awareness of transition. Now, linking to governance. Governance is always changing. Each community, we can look at a small scale, we can look at a larger scale, has its own unique path of development, including its unique path of governance development. We know from various literatures, but also just from observation, that it can rely on procedural reproduction, routine reproduction for periods, but that sometimes there is an awareness that something has to change and that something can change. There's a number of different options that show up then, and these alternatives tend to be forgotten. What the pros and the cons of that were. So this tends to increase the rigidity of the path itself. Another thing that we believe to be kind of a basic but not very often communicated idea is that often there are transitions already going on in a community, especially if we look at a country, because much of that literature is about the country level. If you look in detail, then it is very often the case that there are a number of transitions that started. Some of them stopped or failed transitions. That can be because there was a backlash, can be because there was a change in government, can be because ideas changed. It can be because that transition was actually very problematic, and so forth. It's possible that there is a transition already going on without much interference of policy, while another one might be actually pursued by one policy domain. And for example, it's very well possible that there's one ministry and one policy domain associated with it in a country that is very well aware of bigger environmental problems and that is trying to push from their side a bigger transition. Of course, focusing on their topics. Could be water management, could be biodiversity, could be energy, and so forth. because it is very unlikely also that all the agendas would be similar, that all the interests would be similar, that all the shared narratives, would allow for a natural development of a coordinated transition. Now, if we say we need a strategy, there is an awareness, also very broadly shared awareness, that we need a strategy for transition. That would mean then that, first of all, we need to be aware of this. We cannot just say we have a system we're going to rebuild. Well, first of all, we need to be aware of what already happened in recent history. What are the pros and the cons? Was that coordinated or not? Was that intentional or not? And what are the possibilities of coordinating some of these ongoing transitions, strengthening them at the same time, and then moving as a society in a different direction? Now, when trying to do that, when devising a transition strategy, something else that tends to be overlooked is that there's always drawbacks or this really changed the presentation of this. I don't know what this is. Sorry, but there's always drawbacks and dilemmas in design, that meaning that often the requirements can contradict each other. Whatever design decision you take, design not as in spatial design, but design of the process of transition. If you do this, there's going to be negative implications for something else. And we cannot assume that there's win-win-win situations in everything. Just as we cannot design a car to be the most safe, the fastest, and the cheapest, and the most environmentally friendly at the same time, that is just not possible. And this is not just true in the realm of engineering, this is also true in the realm of public policy and governance. If you focus on this, it's harder there. If you push very hard on one policy topic, then there's a tendency to forget others. If there's central steering that pushes very hard in one direction, you're going to create blind spots, and you might miss local knowledge that tells you, oh, there's other things going on and so forth. So you cannot have flexibility and rigidity in the governance system and in the strategy that is trying to transform that system in a perfect balance. You cannot have centralized and decentralized policy making and implementation in a balance that is perfect for any sustainability transition. The same with formal versus informal. We know we have to respect and take into account and lean on informal institutions if we want to push for the implementation of comprehensive policies and plans and so forth. But there is also no perfect balance. And you cannot just say that this informality is good either, because that informality can also mean that you're making the mafia strong and so forth and so forth. And so forth. So we questioned already, or we tried to come up with our own perspective on sustainability, on transition, and let's now go to strategy.
Yeah, I think that you start to see some of the keywords. We'll come back to them as we start to conclude. But this idea of navigating as perfect balance, it doesn't exist, in that it requires us then to have a way of navigating, yeah. And so strategy then becomes also very relevant in this process of navigation. When is it that we need more of this or less than that, yeah, or of that balancing act? And so it's not just, a strategy should not be seen just as a recipe. We need more of this or less of that, yeah. That becomes problematic. Yeah? It's not just a matter of changing the label of things, of disciplines and so forth. Yeah? We need to go beyond these, just looking and searching for the right procedure. Yeah? We need strategy for system change. And here again comes this idea of system. That is something that is becoming obvious with this presentation, with our book. But that is also implying several complications. going to start to uncover in the last concluding slides. Yeah, because what we need is a change in the system of decision making. We need change of the governance system. Yeah, and it's not just a matter of like, I need a new refrigerator now. Let's buy a new one, get rid of the old appliance and bring in a new system of decision making. It's not as simple as that. It is a monumental task. Yeah. So strategy then becomes crucial. Yeah, it's embedded in this governance system. It is also, I'm hinting here also at one of the important conclusions, that it is also aiming at changing that system. And that becomes complicated for the strategy, but for the system as well. Strategy then is, as we see it, is binding time, and it's creating new worlds. Yeah? And there's some important aspects of strategy, and this comes from our organizational studies from our friend Mintzberg in McGill. He talks about strategy, not just making a strategy. He talks about crafting strategy. It's kind of an art that you need to also incorporate some of that sensitivity to that process of crafting. So it's emergent. Yeah, you need to see a set of existing conditions, virtual possibilities, and a very important role there of a leader. Leadership. It does not need to be one person, a group of people that is able to see these existing conditions, emergent conditions. It needs to be adaptive. Yeah? It transforms the linkages between, as we've said often, the past, the present, and the future. This is how we see strategy. It's both a process and a practice at the same time. This is kind of a way of illustrating. Yeah, a strategy is not just a bunch of papers that you print and leave on the shelves. Yeah, a strategy is something that is very much alive. Yeah, it needs to be. Yeah, it is, and it needs to be because it is both an institution, yeah, with policies, rules, but it's also at the same time a narrative. Yeah? And it needs to be a very convincing narrative. Yeah, and it needs to bind, to connect existing institutions. As I said, it's not just a matter of bringing in a new appliance, yeah, plugging it into the governance system. Yeah, it needs to connect somehow with the existing policies, the existing policy domains, and it needs to connect with existing, and this is an important point, it needs to connect with existing narratives in the system. Now that becomes important for a strategy to be effective and convincing. Yeah, here transition strategy needs this narrative, as I said, to be convincing on several grounds. Perhaps here, just I would like to mention the role again of leadership in that, in seeing how these global narratives can connect to lower levels of decision making, how it can connect to different levels of decision making, and how it can transform narratives of leadership itself and narratives of sustainability of governance. Yeah, and this is important because it will then kind of shield us from very normative assumptions. And so that is important there, the role of leadership in connecting these narratives to the local narrative. And here then we talk about the effects of strategy. We need to be aware that in this process of connecting, then we are also strategy is also having effects. So we distinguish here between the internal effects, internal meaning internal to the system, of governance and decision making, and external reality effects, in the reality, in the environment, in the society. Here the internal effects, we call these goal dependencies. They're shaping that path that Kristof mentioned, that governance path. The reality effects then can be both in the material environment, it could be an infrastructure, those changes, but it is also, and that is important to highlight once again, it can also have effects in the discursive environment, in the narratives that are lingering, that are part of the community. And that can be both in a positive way, but also in a negative. Yeah, I'll quickly here as well. So here, yeah, I want to take some time also to mention that we, because of this, because of all the things that we've discussed, strategy for sustainability transitions, implications, it means that we will encounter resistance. That is something that a strategy for sustainability transitions needs to recognize. That that can be resistance itself, backlash, counter strategy. It can be in any different order, as is not a particular order. It's not a simple succession between resistance, backlash, and counter strategy. And then, as we mentioned, these reality effects, these goal dependencies, can actually result in this collapse of the strategy. So,
can I add one?
Yeah.
So, as Monica said, this can go in many different directions. So some of these reality effects can also be that people start to think it's all nonsense even to care about sustainability, or that climate change is a hoax and so forth. Those are also reality effects, but not aligned with this, with the strategy, of course. But if we're not aware that these effects will most likely occur, and you're not observing that all the time, okay, that tends to undermine the strategy itself. It can lead to election of people who don't care at all about the environment and so forth, and then it becomes a goal dependency. So sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, there's many reasons why sustainability strategies for sustainability transitions will make people upset. Yeah, I think we talked about it. Yeah. These are some of the reasons that can be linked to this upset. Yeah, but I think one important thing just to note there about this idea of resistance or counter strategy is that, in fact, what we've said also often in the presentation is that what we are actually doing with a strategy for sustainability transitions, or a strategy that aims at changing paths, creating new narratives, what we're dealing with is something very sensitive. Yeah, we're dealing with identity. Yeah, we're asking society to change, individuals to change their identity, and that is something very personal, that is kind of natural, that we will encounter resistance, because it's asking societies to change how they see themselves, how they see their future. It's also a possibility, opportunity to create new identities as well. But we need to balance that. We need to be aware of that. Yeah, I think,
I'll go
a little bit faster, so we have a little bit.
And apologies, the computer is eating a good chunk of our slide.
Messages that might have been there.
So coming back.
Like that. The strategy.
I know, this didn't happen at all. It's like saying, okay.
Compatibility.
But okay, so then speaking of coming to our concluding chapter, which is about strategy for sustainability transitions. So what can we say in general? Well, many different things. One of them, that we have to understand governance itself in order to transform governance, which can then transform the relations between society and its environment. But governance shows, am I doing this wrong again? No, okay, I'm not going to.
The middle one.
Yeah, I tried. Governance shows up in two distinct ways here, like as an input and as an output, because we know the result of a strategy will have to be a different form of the governance system. We also know that we want to safeguard whatever we understand as good governance. This includes some ideas on dealing with diversity, with inequality, some ideas of checks and balances and so forth, because it's easy to jeopardize all those things for the greater good of transition. It's also important as an input, meaning that it is not always clear that we are ready to even start articulating, devising a transition strategy if we don't understand very well how the governance system actually works. If our self-understanding is based on a number of mythologies and simplifications and so forth. It's also not clear if this is going to work if we don't know exactly if the tools that we have are working. For example, if we believe that our environmental policies work reasonably well, we just amp them up a little bit, and then we have an aspect of sustainability. Yeah, well, often governments and administrations are completely wrong, and I'm making it a little bit more dramatic because I believe it is dramatic, not a little bit, but completely wrong about the actual functioning of the policy tools that they have and the actual resistance that there is in society, the actual connections with scientific knowledge that there is, and so forth and so forth. So these are some of the things that we already covered. Sorry, yes,
In the previous one.
Yeah.
I think something that summarizes that, it's this dilemma that you need good governance to be able, that's like a prerequisite to be able to come up with a strategy for sustainability. At the same time, it's also a result of it. Yeah?
Yeah.
So it is something that adds to the complication
If
there.
Mr. Putin, linking to what Monica just said, if Mr. Putin comes up with a very ambitious, very integrated, scientifically underpinned transition strategy, he might have the power actually to push through a number of decisions that would be very difficult here. But you can also, of course, predict that his cronies will take the big contracts and so forth, and they won't care about what is happening to certain ethnic groups and so forth and so forth.
Sorry.
So, no. So observation, the importance of observation here. So, okay, we cannot know exactly this is where we have to go and keep that fixed. We'll have to adapt that on a regular basis. Also, the strategy itself will have to be adaptive. That means that observation becomes more important. Observation in governance, sustainability leadership, of governance, of the community, of the social ecological system. But that's not easy, of course, because the perspective on governance and on the relation between governance, community, environment that we just presented, that things become a little bit complicated. You always have to observe, and I highlight this one, the goal dependencies of old policies and of new policies of the first steps, let's say, in a transition strategy on governance itself. Is there, for example, growing resistance within certain departments? Is there a backlash in a certain, let's say, a swing state in the United States that has an oversized importance for the president and so forth? Might there be hidden agendas within certain parts of the administration or of politics? Make it very difficult. So observation of the internal environment, of the reality effects, of the backlash, the counter strategy and so forth, and also a regular rethinking of the choices that were made in designing that strategy. Okay, this centralization, centralizing this, decentralizing that. Is this actually working? And then working meaning not just does it have the effects in terms of environmental quality, but also can we push this through? Can we keep going like this? And because there might be, again, political resistance, there might be economic questions, and so forth and so forth. Now, these goal dependencies and reality effects, as we already mentioned, they can be aligned with the intention of the strategy or not. They can be predicted or not. But if they're unpredictable, if they're not aligned, it doesn't mean they're bad. It just means they have to be observed and understood, and that can be taken into account then in the building of the strategy. I won't go too deep here, but I do want to mention that in our perspective, there's always an observation problem when it comes to transitions, in the sense that the system that is observing the environment and that is telling itself, we need to change the relation between ourselves and that environment, that system that knows, okay, we need to change, only understands itself and its environment with the knowledge and the assumptions of that system itself. It's always an internal observation. There is no position possible outside society to see how society works and how it should change to a more sustainable state. We only have the forms of knowledge that we have. We only have the policy tools that we have the values that we have, and so forth. And there might be people within academia, within administration, that are unhappy, for example, with many of the narratives and the values of the broader community. But okay, that's the world we live in. There's many calls for very comprehensive, ambitious planning, long-term strategies for transition that are also just technically not possible with the policy tools that we have. And we know we're not going to get social acceptance if we try to broaden that scope a lot. And then summarizing some of the dilemmas mentioned earlier, we'll always have to balance a real need for focus in the transition strategy, because the transition has to be focused on a limited number of topics, of a simplification also. We cannot pay attention to everything at the same time, and it needs to be understandable for all the stakeholders. It needs to go fast or we're going to drown. There needs to be a radical form of policy integration, meaning that many other topics will be subjugated to the transition goals. This is all true, this is necessary, but at the same time, if we want to minimize the risks of not just backlash, but also just not seeing important environmental, economic effects and so forth, we still need to cultivate diversity, reflexivity, many sites of observations, adaptive capacity, redundancy, and all those things, of course, are slowing it down again and making it more complicated, and introducing discussions and annoying people and questions and so forth, but that cannot be avoided. You need those two things at the same time. I mean, it also goes back in a sense to the more basic question that my other friend Machiavelli from 500 years ago often talks, and that is that really different perspectives have to be present there, and the tension and the conflict between those perspectives, is a very important productive part of governance. So we need to understand all these features of governance that we talked about in order to come up with sustainability strategies, and those strategies have to be more than just addressing a problem. If they're just addressing a problem, we have to change our lives, and that will mean, as Monica said, in many cases, we have to question our own social identities, because we have to clean up the water. That's very unlikely that this is going to be persuasive even internally within an administration. There has to be something positive, meaning a recognition of existing assets that might be protected more, that might be developed more, or new assets that are valuable for the community that can also be brought about in and through that transition strategy. Now, in some cases, as we already mentioned, communities, can be countries, are more ready than others to craft a strategy, but in many cases, there will have to be a phase of transitional governance where there's a very careful scrutiny and self-analysis of the policy tools that are available, of the stories about the relations with the environment that are built into those policy tools, about the assumptions that are built into the political rhetoric of different parties, and so forth, all of which is very difficult, of course. Now, something else that was eaten by the computer here is that in reflecting on that, it's quite important to keep in mind two very basic points, and that is that this here, that knowledge, even a lot of expert knowledge, does not produce decisions. There's always a gap there. There's never an objective need to go from this piece of knowledge to that decision. Decision is always a jump. The second gap, that there's always a jump from a decision to a variety of effects, and that some of those effects in governance, outside governance, will not be observed. Okay? So, but then again, if we're doing very ambitious things, then it becomes more important, again, to cultivate observation, as we said.
I don't want to take too much time because we're almost out.
Last word.
But last words, basically, to say it is not simple. Yeah. And if you encounter the simple approach to addressing these very complex problems than you can be weary of, yeah. Simple solution, complex systems, you know, the problems of complex systems cannot be addressed with simple solutions, yeah. And we know that simplification then leads to these also simplification of diversity, of redundancy. They're reduced when you have a simplified or an oversimplified view of the issues. Yeah. But we also know that if everybody agrees, that is also an issue. Yeah. That is also simplifying. Yeah. You're missing diversity there when everybody agrees. Yeah. And well, yeah, we need to understand that a strategy for sustainability transitions is basically pushing the boundaries of what is governable. It's going into unknown, uncharted territories for governability and governance. And I think that's it, yeah.